Today we're going to be examining the idea of accessing mystical moments in daily life. We are going to examine these mystical modalities as something qualitatively similar to that which is experienced by the yogi or the Zen master or the sages throughout history, but in a much shorter duration of time. A much shorter duration, but still impressionable upon us enough to last and be a reference point to look back to. And as we go through these 3 or 4 different modalities, I'm going to give you examples of the times I've been able to access these feelings. So when we talk about consciousness exploration, the evolution of consciousness, becoming a whole person, you're going to hear that throughout this presentation, the theme of wholeness, meaning the sense that nothing is missing, which in our ordinary everyday lives, we can't maintain for very long. The ego has to get back to the business of survival and work and family and all the things it has to attend to. But it's been my experience that when someone talks about enlightenment as a permanent state, it almost sets us up to fail. And within the last 3 or 4 years, I've found that by preparing my mind to receive moments of very short duration, say 30 seconds to 2 minutes, I will estimate, although it's very hard to be certain about that, 30 seconds to 2 minutes is the duration we're looking for. So I found this quote from Huineng, which syncs right up with our idea. If you realize perfect wisdom for a single moment, then the whole truth is known to you. And perfect wisdom can only be realized for a single moment. We're going to look at 2 different scholars, 2 different people who did in-depth scholarly work on the state, the mystical state. And I believe they represent different ends of the spectrum. The first scholar is Evelyn Underhill, who wrote the her hallmark work called Mysticism, and then a much more approachable book, probably 1/3 the length of Mysticism, called Practical Mysticism. Evelyn Underhill represents the more numinous side, the more mysterious side of the spectrum with regards to her definition of mysticism is always looping back to becoming one with the divine. And that has always been problematic for me because this thing that people refer to as the divine or the ground of being, the cosmic one, it is by its very definition transcends human perception. And if something transcends our perception, how can we know union with it? If something is unknowable, how would we know when we have attained union with it? Except for these resultant feelings of bliss that we're going to be describing and look at various mystics and artists describe. So Underhill describes the mystical state as this: only in certain states, recollection, contemplation, ecstasy, and their allied conditions, does the self contrive to turn out the usual tenets, shut the gateways of the flesh, and let those submerged powers which are capable of picking up messages from another plane of being have their turn. The essence of mystical contemplation is summed in these 2 experiences: union with the flux of life and union with the whole, in which all lesser realities are resumed, and these experiences are well within your reach. That second quote there, you'll see references the whole with a capital W, referencing the divine, or what people generically refer to as God. But there's a very encouraging conclusion there. These experiences are well within your reach. However, Underhill's end of the spectrum puts great demand on the initiate. It's a very serious approach. It's a very monastic approach, and it might not resonate with everyone. So by contrast to that monastic approach on that end of the spectrum, we have William James, who takes a more academic approach. And I really enjoyed that James admitted here in the varieties of religious experience in his chapter on mystical states that he's never experienced a mystical state. And I was uh, relieved to read. Whether my treatment of mystical states will shed light or darkness, I do not know, for my constitution shuts me out from their enjoyment almost entirely, and I can speak of them only at second hand. So what he's saying is, hey, I don't have an example for you, but I've done my research, I've reflected upon these things, and these are four elements that seem to be factors that are cross-culturally around the world and throughout different domains. These four factors seem to be present. So in our mystical moment, we'll be seeing these elements as we go through the different modalities. First is ineffability. It defies expression. The second is noetic quality. It provides insight, illuminations, revelations full of significance. These states are transient, meaning they cannot be sustained for long. For our purposes today, I'm saying much more shorter experience is much more attainable, even if it is qualitatively similar to the bliss experienced for hours on end by a yogi who does this, who doesn't participate maybe in the hustle and bustle of daily life. And then passivity, meaning we can't just close our eyes and stay mystical state activated. We have to prepare our mind to be receptive to these things with a very high degree of mindfulness. But in the times that I've experienced them, I didn't see them coming. And so, in readying the mind for reception, we have here, in proportion as our inward life fails, we go more constantly to the post office. This is Henry David Thoreau, circa 1885, almost foreshadowing social media addiction. And what he's saying here in this analogy is the more our inward life is neglected, the more we turn to the outward world, to the external consensus reality. So he says, you may depend on it that the poor fellow who walks away with the greatest number of letters, proud of his extensive correspondence, has not heard from himself in a long while. I don't think human nature has changed in the last couple hundred years. I think he's hit on something here that will be the closest thing to instruction that we touch on. I'm not going to give instruction. This is going to be something you'll have to spiritually co-create. But if you're looking for a general starting point, it is the fact that when I have entered into these mystical states on each occasion, I wasn't looking at my phone. I wasn't thinking about calling someone or messaging someone. I hadn't watched the news that day. I wasn't thinking about socio-political issues. I was in a completely present state. Something else I'll add right up front. Each of the times I've entered into these moments was not during closed eye meditation. And that may simply reflect upon me as a poor or below average meditator. I don't do closed eye meditation as much as I do active imagining and different types of reflections like that. So these states that came upon me were just while I was walking around doing in my daily routine. Carl Jung framed the experience pretty well. First, we'll look at a quote from his in Aeon, which ties in first just in a form of comparative religion, cross-culturally. He compares these mystical states to the idea of wholeness and the attempt to gain wholeness, which he called the individuation process. This is exactly what happens in the individuation process, whether it take the form of Christian transformation, except as you become as little children, or a Satori experience in Zen, show me your original face, or a psychological process of development in which the original propensity to wholeness becomes a conscious happening. We're going to see that term wholeness come up over and over again with different people from different domains. And the reason I included this is because if you're looking for a descriptor other than those four factors from James, the easiest way to describe this mystical moment, which may only last a minute, is that wholeness Psychological and emotional wholeness means for just a moment, nothing is missing. We have no concerns for the future, no regrets for the past. There's no longing for another person or loneliness. For a moment, there's no anger or fear of the world. Where there's nowhere else we'd rather be. We're in the exact correct place at the exact correct time, and time itself seems to drop away. Then Jung also wrote the introduction to D.T. Suzuki's Zen Buddhism, which we're going to look at closer here, but there's some great quotes that have important points here. We can, of course, never decide definitively whether a person is really enlightened or redeemed, or whether they merely imagine it. It is not, therefore, a question of actual fact, but spiritual reality, that is to say, the psychic occurrence of the happening known as satori. I thought this was genius for Jung to point this out. I actually laughed out loud in a coffee shop. Looked like a total weirdo when I read that line, um, because what he's saying here is not what he's not referring to people that fake the experience and lie about it. He's not talking about people that exaggerate the experience to show off. He's talking about you and I believing that we experienced it. If even for 30 seconds or a minute, if it felt like what we're describing here, if it felt like wholeness for a second, then who is to say that you did not have access to that moment, which can now serve as a reference point for you in the future? And then a very important key point here, Jung points out, it is not that something different is seen, but that one sees differently. So the first modality we'll look at is of these mystical moments is satori. There's an Eckhart Tolle quote here. I don't like quotes that don't cite their reference, the book. You'll notice I always try and include a page number as well. In the day and age we live in now, I think it's very important to cite your source. But Tolle describes Zen master's use of the word satori as a flash of insight, a moment of no mind, and total presence. But the best definition I have found is from D.T. Suzuki, who wrote Zen Buddhism. It's a great introductory book to Zen. Satori may be defined as intuitive looking into, in contradistinction to intellectual and logical understanding. Whatever the definition, Satori means the unfolding of a new world hitherto unperceived in the confusion of the dualistic mind. For our purposes, let's consider the dualistic mind, the ego, which handles self-preservation and achievement and communication and work and all the things we have to do in our waking life, and what I'll call the mystical unconscious or the sublime state, that other realm, the dream world. So I'll give you here my first example of what I call satori, and then we'll look at, as we go through these modalities, you're going to see similarities between them. I was walking down the street in Chicago downtown Chicago during a cold winter night, but I wasn't going anywhere. I was coming from somewhere, some social occasion, I can't even remember what. And for a moment, I was just enjoying the air on my face. That was the last thing I can remember, is just feeling the air on my face. Instead of feeling, oh, it stinks that it's winter and it's cold, the air on my face felt pleasant, and I paused. I stopped to enjoy it, and a drop of water fell from an icicle above and fell right on my forehead. I didn't wipe it off. I stood there enjoying this moment where it seemed like I was in the exact right moment at the exact right time to feel nothing but that moment where nothing was missing, and I was at the right place in the right time for that particular drop of water to come down and join me beneath it. The next modality we're going to look at, you don't often hear referenced, but I'm including it because it is the most frequently occurring, although I've only experienced it in a high order of magnitude a couple times, say 3 or 4 times in the last couple of years. It is the most frequently occurring in lower orders of magnitude. The experience of synchronicity for me is one of a prolonged deja vu. So my experiences of deja vu have been, 3 seconds, 3 to 4 seconds, I would estimate. In a high order of synchronicity, that means this meaningful coincidence that is just of astronomical, improbable um, order of magnitude. They can last for up to 30 seconds, and it feels like this prolonged deja vu. So I quote here from Carl Jung, who wrote the book on synchronicity called Synchronicity, and he's the gentleman who's done the most study on the phenomena when it started happening to him. The problem of synchronicity has puzzled me for a long time. I was investigating the phenomena of the collective unconscious and kept coming across connections which I simply could not explain as chance groupings. That doesn't only mean in his research, he means things were occurring to him, happening to him. I believe one of the examples was he researched some scarab beetle from Egypt, and then the same type of rare beetle landed on his windowsill the next day at his office. And then the next day, a patient came in and shared her dream with a beetle in it, a scarab beetle in it. Um, so what I found were coincidences which were connected so meaningfully that their chance occurrence would represent a degree of improbability that would have to be expressed by an astronomical figure. The synchronicity principle asserts that the terms of a meaningful coincidence are connected by simultaneity and meaning. Now, very important point here to self-monitor ourselves with. I believe it's very important to acknowledge that we determine the meaning of synchronicity events. They're wonderful when they happen. But if we allow ourselves to fantasize that, something is sending me a message, something outside my cranium, something outside my mind, the universe, God, something is speaking to me, we risk what I believe a psychotherapist would refer to as delusions of reference. And it's an easy check and balance. We simply enjoy these experiences by saying that we assign the meaning and that that their origins and are mysterious, and the phenomena is mysterious. If Carl Jung couldn't figure it out, we're not going to be able to figure it out. So, again, from Jung, the suspicion that this must be a case of meaningful coincidence, i.e., an acausal connection, is very natural. I must own that this run of events made a considerable impression on me. It seemed to have a certain numinous quality, and that's the key here. Jung is also saying that he experienced these events as slightly mystical, this numinous quality. If we refer back to James's 4 aspects, the numinous means spiritually mysterious. My example of, and I have this slide up here. Why is it that we, as children, we used to enjoy looking over at the clock and seeing it say 11:11 at that moment? Is it pattern recognition? Is it symmetry? Just the symmetry of the moment in time? Those things may explain why they're pleasurable, but it doesn't fill in the blank as far as the meaningful coincidence. So my experience of synchronicity was pretty intense. I had the one with the highest order of magnitude happened in early 2019, and I was wrestling with a very emotionally dark issue, and my ego kept summoning my self-defenses to defend my current position. But when I would do my active imagining, particularly under the influence of sativa strain of marijuana, where my ego was dismantled or partly dismantled, ego defenses were partly dismantled. I was getting messages, my unconscious personifications that would say, hey, I think we've got a blind spot called the shadow. Jung called this the shadow. I think we have a blind spot on this issue. I don't think we're being honest with ourselves. I think we have an emotionally dark spot here, and we need to get around this. So I was walking out the door one day. I've lived in the same condo for 7 years at that point, and never in the 7 years that I've lived there have I seen a light bulb burned out in the common hallways. But that day, when I'm struggling with this darkness, this emotional malady that I suspected may have a dark spot, I walk out my door and I find myself standing in a dark hallway. You know, when you first encounter a light bulb that's out, you need a second to register what's happening, but you only know that the environment is different. And And in that second, it occurred to me almost immediately, without logically thinking it through. That means the answer was just readily available. It said, what are the odds that in the 7 years you lived here, no light bulb has ever been burned out in this hallway, but now the light bulb directly outside the threshold of your home is burned out? And to me, immediately it became a symbol that there is a dark spot in the threshold of my consciousness. And I need to get down into the unconscious to find it. Well, there was another important aspect to this beautiful experience. It lasted so long, probably 30 seconds. I'm standing there in the darkness, acknowledging the meaningful coincidence between the light bulb being burned out on that particular day in 7 years that I was struggling with the darkness at my threshold of my consciousness. And my ego stepped up to do what the ego is supposed to do. It said, there's got to be a logical reason for this. This isn't something necessarily I would say we have to fight. This is the ego pulling you back into the everyday world, pulling you back from what some would say is a mystical experience and what some would say is madness if you have no control over it. So my ego said, this might coincide, this light bulb burned out, with some maintenance schedule. Let's walk around the whole hall, and if we find another, of the whole floor of my building, and if we find another single light bulb burned out, then this didn't have any meaning. So I walked around the entire floor, my entire floor of the building, and there wasn't another light bulb burned out. And so my ego next said, well, let's proceed to the next floor down. Let's move floor by floor through this mid-rise building and try and find another light bulb burned out to discredit my synchronicity experience. And that's when I started to laugh and got a hold of myself and said, okay, let's stop. It was a beautiful moment. It's just synchronicity. It's fading now. The ego can relax, and we can now take this meaningful experience as something that is a reminder to us we have work to do. The next type of modality for the mystical experience you're going to see closely parallels Satori. Whereas Satori is Buddhist and therefore spiritual in nature, aesthetic arrest came from a great mind who had lost their religious faith. James Joyce was an Irish Catholic, and he no longer could find mystical experience in the religious tradition that he grew up with. And as he's struggling with this, he came up with a definition of these moments that's very secular, called aesthetic arrest. Joseph Campbell speaks to this from the Inner Reaches of Outer Space. He says, we speak of aesthetic arrest as when one is not moved to physical action of any kind, but held in a sensational contemplation and enjoyment. In Joyce's words, the mind is arrested above desire and loathing. And you'll see there, he couldn't, James Joyce couldn't help but reference the Buddha's obstacles to bliss, fear, and desire. Campbell goes on to say, James Joyce, in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, put his mind to the problem of reawakening the eye and heart to wonder, to the invention of hitherto unknown science of escape from bondage on the wings of art. He concludes here with something I think is very important. 3 things are needed to experience beauty: wholeness, harmony, and radiance. And that is Joseph Campbell quoting James Joyce, who was quoting Aquinas, who was quoting Aristotle. Think about the repetition of these thematic elements. Wholeness, again, nothing is missing. Harmony, we're in the exact right place at the exact right time. And then radiance, the world seems to glow. So my experience with aesthetic arrest, very similar to Satori, once again, I was not walking to something. I was coming from an event. I was actually coming from a class. I was taking night classes a couple of years ago. And the elevator in the building of this downtown Chicago mid-rise was broken. And I was pretty bummed out on the walk up. I have bad knees and was kind of cranky about it. But walking down the stairs after class, I was in a very sublime mood. I was very present. I was happy to be back in the classroom as a middle-aged adult. And as I'm walking down the stairs, I look up and I see the spider web that's attached to the emergency light in this concrete stairwell. And I stopped and I paused and I couldn't stop looking at this spider web and the geometry of this thing, and the knowledge of geometry genetically transmitted to the spider to be able to build this thing. And then this feeling of connecting with the spider web, its sense of frailty, its vanishing frailty, to quote um, uh, of Time in the River. I can't remember who wrote Of Time in the River. And its frailty, the frailty and and temporary nature of the spider web suddenly took on the same element as this giant downtown structure I was standing in. This feat of engineering became something equally as frail and vanishing. It was all temporary. And then I saw myself in this scheme of temporary and frail and vanishing. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was all a moment of wholeness and harmony. Okay, it wouldn't be an Abaya Porta lecture if we don't touch on psychedelics. But you're going to see as the fourth modality we'll look at today, these things sync up. And this is from, of course, Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. And it's worth noting here, Huxley wasn't just an author. He wrote the Perennial Philosophy. He was a scholar of comparative religion. So this is someone who knows this mystical domain. When Huxley took the mescaline, he says, I was not looking now at an unusual flower arrangement. I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation, the miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence. And of course, Huxley is being metaphorical. He goes on to say, my eyes traveled from rose to carnation, and from that feathery incandescence to the smooth scrolls of sentient amethyst, which were the iris. The beatific vision, Sat Chit Ananda, being awareness bliss. For the first time, I understood precisely and completely what these syllables referred to. Um, he then finishes, the mind does its perceiving in terms of intensity of existence, profoundly of significance, relationships within a pattern. And here we stop and recall my feeling of the relationship of the spider web to the superstructure it was hanging in, to me, and all of these things seeming to fit into the same pattern. I felt like a part of a larger whole. I saw the books on the bookshelf, but was not at all concerned with their positions in space. What I noticed, what impressed itself upon my mind, was the fact that all of them glowed with a living light. Well, psychedelics have this numinous quality, this ineffable quality, as James put it, that says we're not going to be able to describe it. Now, if you're a genius like Huxley, a literary genius, you can use all this flowery language and metaphors and allegories, helps us to grasp the idea. But one thing I want to convey here is that now that psychedelics are slowly in 2020 coming into acceptance of their therapeutic value, um, of their psychological and emotional value to people that use them. It's important to note that psychedelics is not a mystical pill. You don't pop it and say, okay, I'm going to have a mystical experience. You're not guaranteed a mystical moment, even when you take psychedelics. And I know this from experience because I've had a mystical moment within a psilocybin trip. And the rest of the time, when we were on these magic mushrooms, it was just fun and games. We were with people and we were laughing and exploring and talking and um, enjoying ourselves. But a mystical moment came to me when I was with two friends in Northern California, and these are very successful adults. They're relatively serious people, and they at this particular moment in time, I was skipping through the living room, and I looked to my left, and they were sitting on the floor trying to play patty cake or something and just cracking up, and these big smiles on these people's faces who are normally serious, synced up with the song that was playing, which was Nirvana's Come As You Are. And in this moment, I'm skipping through the living room, everything slowed down to slow motion, and everything seemed to sync up. There was nothing missing. I was with the exact right people at the exact right time. There was no other place in the universe I was supposed to be. And that moment of wholeness was my only psychedelic mystical moment, the come as you are moment. So that's our lecture for today. I hope you got something out of this, at least some descriptors that might give you a reference point for enjoying the experience of these things. Tattvamasi, thanks for listening.